Welcome to the Sleepy Christian, a place where we gently explore the mysteries of faith, scripture, and divine encounters, one quiet story at a time. Tonight, we're climbing a sacred mountain, not with our feet, but with our hearts and minds. We're going to revisit that moment when Moses ascended Mount Sinai, but not to repeat what you already know. Instead, we'll uncover the hidden, often overlooked moments, those whispers of divine presence that slipped past the thunder and lightning. So find a peaceful place, settle in, and let the story unfold like a prayer whispered on the wind. And before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your country or city in the comments. I'd love to know where our Sleepy Christian family is tuning in from. Before the fire, before the smoke, before the voice of God shook the mountain top, there was silence. Not the kind of silence that makes you restless, like the ticking of a clock in a quiet room. No, this was a deeper silence. The kind that wraps itself around you like a cloak. The kind that feels alive, breathing, watching. As Moses stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, the people were behind him, fearful, murmuring, waiting. But ahead of him was something no man had ever seen, something he was being called into. And before he could take his first step up that holy mountain, there was a stillness so complete that it made time seem to stop. Have you ever stood in a place so quiet, so undisturbed, that even your own heartbeat sounded loud? That was the moment Moses found himself in. And in that silence, something happened. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was real. The rocks beneath his feet seemed to hum, not with sound, but with presence, as if the very stones were remembering something ancient, something sacred. The air was thin, but thick with meaning. The wind didn't blow, but it watched. And the light around him didn't just illuminate, it revealed. Moses had heard the voice of God before, at the burning bush, in dreams, through thunder. But this was different. This was not a voice made of words. This was the language of waiting, of reverence, the language of stillness. God was there, but he was not speaking, not yet. And maybe that's what startled Moses most. We often expect God to speak through signs, wonders, and miracles. But sometimes, before the miracle, comes the moment of emptiness, where nothing moves, where nothing happens. And yet, in that nothing, everything is already present. Moses stood there, not knowing how long he waited. Seconds, minutes, hours. Time bends when eternity brushes up against it. And in that sacred hush, he began to understand something very few ever grasp. That before God reveals himself to a person, he first strips away all the noise. The noise of ego, the noise of fear, the noise of other people's opinions, the noise of yesterday, the noise of tomorrow. Only then, when the soul is silent, can the heart begin to hear. Maybe that's why the mountain had to be high. Maybe that's why the crowd had to be left behind. Because not everyone is ready for silence. Not everyone wants it. But Moses did. Or at least, he was willing to enter it. And in that moment of holy quiet, he realized something profound. God doesn't always announce his arrival. Sometimes, he waits for you to notice he's already there. So Moses didn't rush. He didn't speak. He didn't even pray. He just stood in the silence, letting it wash over him, letting it prepare him. Because the fire was coming, the thunder was coming. But first, the silence had to do its work. The path up the mountain was not marked. There were no signs, no steps carved into the rock, no obvious trail to follow. It was just stone, cold, jagged, and ancient. Moses looked upward, toward the summit, where the cloud of divine presence hovered like a veil between heaven and earth. There was no map, only the quiet urging in his spirit, telling him, climb. And so he began. Every step forward was an act of trust, not just in his footing, but in the one who had called him. With each stone he stepped over, with each patch of loose gravel that threatened to slide, Moses had to surrender his control. This wasn't just a physical climb, it was spiritual, emotional, a slow stripping away of the man he had been, to become the man who would meet God face to face. The mountain didn't welcome him. It wasn't warm or soft. It was stern, untouched, as though it had been waiting for centuries for someone like him to ascend, not because he was special, but because he was willing to walk into the unknown. The further he climbed, the more the world below disappeared. The sounds of the people, once murmuring in confusion and fear, faded. The smells of the campfires, the bleating of goats, the everyday rhythms of the earth all grew faint. He was leaving behind the ordinary to enter something utterly other, and as he moved higher, something began to change in the air. It grew thinner, yes, but also heavier. Heavier with a presence. A weight not on his shoulders, but in his soul. He didn't know if it was awe or fear or wonder, or all three mixed together, but it compelled him forward. Along the way, Moses may have noticed things, strange things, a bird that didn't fly away, a flower growing out of a rock where no plant should live, a breeze that seemed to speak without sound. These weren't miracles in the traditional sense. They were gentle signs, quiet affirmations. You are not climbing alone. Perhaps there were moments when Moses stopped to breathe, placing his hand against the rock for balance, and felt something warm pulsing beneath the cold stone. Not physical warmth, but a spiritual one, as if the mountain itself remembered God's footsteps from long ago. The path was not straight. It twisted. It forced him to go sideways, to double back, to climb over obstacles that made no sense. There were no shortcuts. Every part of the journey had purpose, even if Moses didn't yet know what it was. Maybe that's the way of every divine path. It reveals nothing at the start and everything at the end. As he moved, he shed pieces of himself, not clothing, but burdens, doubts, the lingering fear that he was unworthy, the memories of failure in Egypt, the weight of leading people who questioned him at every turn, all of it left behind with each higher step. And at times, Moses might have questioned himself. Am I really going the right way? Did I hear correctly? What if I fall? What if I fail? But then came a stillness, not the kind of silence he felt at the base of the mountain, but a stillness within his own heart, the kind that only comes when your spirit begins to match the rhythm of God's presence. He was being drawn upward by something more than gravity, something deeper than a calling, a relationship, a pull not from outside but from within, like a memory written into the soul long before he was born. This was not a path anyone else could walk for him, not Aaron, not Joshua, not Miriam. This was Moses' path alone. And isn't that true for all of us? There are moments in life, especially the ones closest to God, where no one can go with you. You must climb, you must wrestle, you must walk the rocky road of faith with trembling hands and steady steps. The higher he climbed, the less he belonged to the world below. At a certain point, the sky seemed closer than the earth. The air tasted like purity. The silence wasn't just around him, it was in him. That deep kind of peace that doesn't erase fear but outshines it. And when he looked back, he could no longer see the people, only clouds, only sky, only the quiet sense that something holy was just ahead. He had left the world of men, and now With each step, he entered the world of God, not by force, but by surrender, not with loud praise, but with quiet breath. This was not a triumph. It was a homecoming, a return to something forgotten, a reawakening to the truth that we are always being called higher, not to escape the world, but to see it through the eyes of heaven. And still, he climbed. The mountain was now hidden, not by night, not by distance, but by a thick, swirling veil of smoke and cloud that settled around its peak like a crown. To the people below, it was terrifying. The thunder, the flashes of light, the sound of a trumpet growing louder and louder, it all made them tremble. They stood far off, afraid even to look. But Moses stepped into it. To the ordinary eye, it might have looked like a storm, but this was no ordinary cloud. It did not move with the wind. It had a weight to it, a presence. It wasn't smoke from firewood or mist from the mountain's breath. This was glory wrapped in shadow, the very presence of God cloaked in mystery, a divine hiding place. Moses didn't flinch. He didn't run. He walked forward into the unknown, into the thick darkness where God was. As he passed through the edges of the cloud, the world behind him faded completely. The sun disappeared. The earth fell silent. It was as if Moses had stepped out of time and into eternity, a space where the rules of nature no longer applied, where the veil between the seen and the unseen was stretched thin enough to tear at any moment. Inside the cloud, vision failed. He could not see his hands, could not see the path, but he felt. The presence was overwhelming, neither warm nor cold, but something else entirely. The closest word might be holy, but even that falls short. It was as if every cell in his body stood still, listening, as if every part of him knew, this is not a place to speak, this is a place to receive. And there, in the thick gloom, Moses realized a paradox. The closer you come to God, the more you realize how little you understand. Light had always been a symbol of God, pure, radiant, revealing. But here, God chose to dwell in darkness. Not evil darkness, not the absence of good, but the darkness of mystery, the sacred hiddenness of the divine. We often want clarity. We want answers. We want to see everything. But sometimes, when God draws near, he doesn't show himself in dazzling light. Sometimes, he cloaks himself in clouds to teach us how to walk by faith and not by sight. And Moses walked slowly, carefully, deeper into the cloud. Each step was a step into mystery. The air was thick, yet alive. Breathing, watching, listening. It was as if the cloud itself was a living thing, holding Moses, enclosing him, welcoming him into its silence. Perhaps it felt like a womb, a sacred enclosure where something new was being formed. Not a child, but a prophet. A man who had spoken to burning bushes and split seas, now being reshaped, redefined in this hidden place. And yet, even in the cloud, there were glimpses, not of form or figure, but of something. Maybe a shimmer of glory at the edge of perception. Maybe the sense of a voice, not speaking in words, but directly to the heart. It was not thunder now. It was not fire. It was stillness. The kind that doesn't scream, but pierces. The kind that speaks things you can't unhear, even if no sound is made. In that thick cloud, Moses may have lost all sense of himself, not in fear, but in surrender. He wasn't just a shepherd or a leader. He wasn't a Hebrew or an Egyptian. In that moment, he was simply a soul, bare before its maker. And when the soul is bare, there is no pretense, no pride, no need to prove anything, only humility, only worship. We forget sometimes that mystery is a gift. In a world obsessed with clarity, God still chooses to speak from clouds. He still calls us into places where we don't understand. Because it's in those places, those veils of smoke and sacred shadow, that we stop leaning on our own understanding. We stop trying and start trusting. The people below saw the cloud and were afraid, but Moses discovered something the people never did, that what looks like chaos from the outside can be pure peace on the inside, that what seems dark can be filled with the light of a presence too holy to behold. He stayed there in that divine fog for 6 days before God even spoke a word. 6 days of nothingness, 6 days of waiting. Can you imagine? Waiting in darkness with no explanation, no plan, just presence, just trust. That is the training ground of a true servant of God, not in action, but in stillness, not in doing, but in being. And then, after 6 days of silence, the voice came, not from the sky, but from within the cloud, a voice not made of sound, but of spirit, a voice that had waited until Moses was ready to receive, until his soul was quiet enough to listen. Most people want God to appear in the sunlight, in the clear sky, in the clean and obvious moments. But Moses saw something different. He saw the God who hides in the cloud, not to confuse us, but to purify us, to teach us that the deepest truths are not shouted, but whispered, not laid out, but revealed, slowly, in sacred smoke. And when Moses finally emerged, his face shone, not because of what he had learned, but because of where he had been, inside the cloud, inside the mystery, inside the heart of God. There, within the thick cloud that wrapped the mountain like a shroud, Moses stood, still and silent. No voice came, no command thundered from the heavens, no blazing vision unfolded before his eyes. Only quiet, only darkness, only the overwhelming presence of God pressing in around him like unseen hands. And yet, in that moment of absolute stillness, something profound began to stir. We often think of divine encounters as filled with noise, burning bushes that speak, seas that split, voices that command. But what happens when the voice of God says nothing? When the Creator, who formed the universe with words, chooses silence instead? For Moses, this was not a void. It was not emptiness. It was a different kind of voice. A voice without syllables, a truth without sound. It spoke not to his ears, but to his soul. And its message was not one of law or history or instruction, but of presence. A presence so full, so complete that no words were needed. This was the voice that didn't speak, and yet it spoke volumes. In the stillness, Moses began to remember, not events, but being. His own smallness, his frailty, the fragility of human breath when placed next to the infinite. And in that realization, he didn't feel shame. He didn't feel fear. He felt something much deeper. Awe, reverence, the kind that brings a man to his knees, not because he's afraid, but because he's finally home. There was no pressure to perform, no need to impress, no requirement to understand. The silence itself was enough. And that may be the very reason God remained quiet, for Moses to learn what few ever do, that God's presence is not dependent on words. That the deepest communion with the divine is not found in answers, but in stillness. Think of the human soul as a surface of water. When stirred, it reflects nothing, but when still, perfectly still, it becomes a mirror. And in that mirror, something begins to appear. not an image of ourselves, but a reflection of something eternal. Moses, in that quiet space, began to see what couldn't be seen, not with his eyes, but with his spirit. The same way we sometimes see a truth in our hearts before we can put it into words. There are moments in life, precious and rare, when we are not being taught something new, but are being reminded of something old, something ancient that we've always known, but forgotten. Perhaps Moses remembered the garden, not Eden itself, but the deep peace that must have lived there before the fall, the walk with God in the cool of the day, the unbroken fellowship, the unshattered trust. Maybe he remembered the sound of nothingness, before the world was spoken into being, before "let there be light," there was just God, complete, sufficient, whole. And now, standing in the shadow of that same wholeness, Moses felt what Adam must have felt, before shame, before distance, before the hiding. The voice that didn't speak said, "You are with me." And somehow, that was enough. There is a reason mystics and saints across centuries have sought silence, not to escape, but to listen. Because they understood what Moses understood here, that the word of God is not limited to sound waves. That revelation doesn't always thunder, it sometimes whispers, and sometimes it simply rests. And in that resting, transformation begins. Moses was not receiving commandments yet. He wasn't being given tablets of stone or laws of life. He was being shaped by silence, emptied of noise, emptied of self. Not broken, but softened, like a clay vessel warmed by fire, becoming ready to hold something sacred. This is the part of the story no one talks about. We remember the fire, we remember the tablets, but we forget the quiet, the sacred hush that came before it all, the voice that didn't speak, and yet prepared Moses for everything to come. And maybe, just maybe, this silence was a gift not just for Moses, but for us too. Because in a world filled with noise, where every moment is filled with information, opinions, distractions, what we long for most isn't another word. It's presence. Real, sacred, unshakable presence. The kind you don't hear with your ears, but feel with your soul. The kind that reminds you you are known, you are seen, you are held. So Moses stood still, and God said nothing. But in that nothing was everything. We often picture Moses waiting for God, standing in silence wrapped in cloud, listening for the thunder of a voice that once split seas and shattered stone. And it's true, Moses was waiting. But there's something far more mysterious, more beautiful, hidden beneath the surface of this moment. God was waiting too. This is something most people never consider. We imagine God as the one who acts, who initiates, who commands, and he does. But sometimes, God chooses to wait. Not because he is uncertain, not because he is weak, but because love waits, because relationship waits, because God is not interested in performance, he is interested in the heart. There on the mountain, Moses had left behind the noise of the camp, the people, the demands, the constant questions of leadership, the burdens of being a prophet, a guide, a voice. He had stepped into stillness, into a different kind of time. And though he may have thought he was waiting for God to move, something deeper was unfolding. God was preparing Moses, not with lightning, not with lectures, but with silence. For 6 days, Moses remained in the cloud. No vision, no message, just stillness. Can you imagine what that felt like? The growing uncertainty, the quiet questions in the mind. Why hasn't God spoken yet? Did I do something wrong? Am I truly called? But this was not punishment. This was preparation. And the silence wasn't a delay. It was divine timing. God was not in a hurry. He never is. His pace is eternity, and his goal is always deeper than information. He waits until the soul is still, until the storm of the heart settles, until the noise of ambition, pride, or insecurity fades into quiet. Because only then, only in that tender stillness, can the soul truly receive what is sacred. Moses thought he was coming up the mountain to get the commandments, but God was offering more than law. He was offering himself. Think about it. Why didn't God just speak immediately? Why let Moses sit in thick darkness for 6 days? Because the greatest revelations of God do not come to the hurried. They come to the patient, to the emptied, to the surrendered. God was waiting for Moses, not to arrive physically, but to arrive spiritually. To come not just with his feet, but with his whole being. And while Moses waited, God waited too. He waited for Moses' soul to quiet, for the last pieces of distraction to fall away, for the subtle fears to melt, for the prophet to become nothing more than a child before his father. This is the difference between a servant and a friend. A servant obeys orders. A friend shares silence. And Moses was becoming a friend of God. In the world below, everything moved fast. The people were anxious. They built a golden calf in his absence, desperate for answers, for control, for noise. But Moses was learning something altogether different. That in the presence of God, there is no need to make anything happen, no need to produce, no need to impress, only to be. And perhaps that is why God waited, because true intimacy cannot be rushed. Sacred things take time. Seeds must rest in the dark soil before they bloom, and souls must rest in divine stillness before they shine. There's something deeply personal about the idea of God waiting. It means he's not just a force or a judge. He's a father, a friend, a lover of souls. And like any deep relationship, he doesn't barge in. He stands at the door and knocks. He waits until you're ready. Not perfect, not polished, just ready. Moses wasn't climbing a mountain to do something. He was climbing to become something. And in the cloud, God waited for Moses to become still enough, quiet enough, empty enough to receive more than law. He was about to receive glory. Most people never experience this because they never wait long enough. They give up in the silence. They assume God isn't speaking. They turn back. But Moses stayed. And God waited for that. For the heart to open like a flower at dawn. For the noise to fall away. For the soul to say, without words, "Here I am." And then, only then, did the voice speak. But it wasn't just the sound of God's voice that mattered. It was what came before it. The waiting, the watching, the holy stillness that shaped the man before the message arrived. In that sacred pause, God and Moses met. Not in action, but in presence. Not in loudness, but in love. And that kind of communion is only possible when two hearts are willing to wait for one another. It was a request born not of arrogance, but of longing. Moses had seen more of God than any man alive. He had heard his voice, stood in his cloud, received his law. But still, something deeper stirred within him. A hunger no miracle could satisfy. A thirst no sign could quench. And so, with trembling boldness, Moses spoke the words that echo through history. "Show me your glory." It was not a demand. It was a cry. a soul reaching for its source. For Moses, God's works were no longer enough. He had seen the parting sea, the burning bush, the manna from heaven. But now, he wanted the face behind the wonders. He wanted to see the very nature of God, not just his power, but his heart. And what came next is among the most mysterious and intimate moments in all of Scripture. God did not reject the request. He did not chastise Moses for reaching too high, but neither did he grant it fully, because to see the fullness of God's glory, to gaze upon the eternal face of I Am, is to look into a light so pure, so powerful, that no mortal body can withstand it. It is too much, not because God is cruel, but because he is holy, and holiness burns hotter than any fire we know. It's not just light, it's truth, unveiled. God, in his mercy, answered the request in a way that both protected Moses and revealed something no one else had seen. He told Moses, "There is a place near me where you may stand upon a rock, and when my glory passes by, I will put you in the cleft of the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed. Then I will remove my hand, and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen." It's a passage cloaked in divine mystery. What does it mean to see God's back? What does it mean to be covered by his hand? Perhaps it means this, that when we ask to see God fully, he gives us just enough to change us, without destroying us. He reveals what we can bear, and often what he reveals is not a dazzling vision, but a passing presence, a whisper of glory, glimpsed just after it moves by. Moses stood in that cleft, a crack in the rock, a hiding place carved by time and storm, and waited. The same man who had stood boldly before Pharaoh now stood trembling before the presence of the Eternal. And then, it happened. God passed by. Not in thunder, not in lightning, but in a proclamation of who he is. As he passed, he spoke, not his commands, but his character. The Lord, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. Moses didn't just see God's glory, he heard it. And what he heard was not fury, but mercy, not vengeance, but compassion, not dominance, but patience. This was the true glory of God, not his might, but his mercy. And Moses, hidden in the rock, covered by God's own hand, caught a glimpse, not of form, but of essence, not of eyes or face, but of movement, of presence, of the echo of God's passing. It is a holy paradox. The closer we come to God, the less we see with our eyes, and the more we perceive with our spirit. Because glory is not always visible, sometimes it is felt, known, etched into the soul without ever touching the skin. And when God removed his hand, Moses saw not the face of God, but the aftermath, the residue of glory, the fading edge of eternity brushing against the mortal world. And that alone was enough to change him forever. He came down from the mountain with his face shining, literally glowing with reflected light. So much so that the people were afraid to look at him. He had seen something too holy to describe, too sacred to explain. And the light on his face wasn't just a reflection of glory, it was a mark of intimacy, a visible sign that he had been near to God in a way no one else had. What Moses saw on that mountain wasn't just a divine spectacle, it was the heart of God. And he saw it not in dazzling form, but in the quiet humility of mercy, in the hand that shielded him, in the whisper of presence, in the shadow of glory that passed by like the wind. There's a lesson here, buried in holy stillness, that the most powerful experiences of God are not always loud or visible. They are often veiled, partial, mysterious. Because what he offers us is not always what we ask for, it is what we need. And when we ask to see his glory, he often shows us something far deeper. His goodness, his patience, his gentleness, his faithfulness that endures through every age. And just like Moses, we too are invited into the cleft of the rock, not to see everything, but to see enough. Enough to trust, enough to worship, enough to walk back down the mountain carrying light we never had before. Because once you've glimpsed the back of God, even just a shadow, you are never the same again. There are moments in Scripture where the words stop, but the story continues. Moments where something clearly happened, something monumental, even divine, but it was never written down. It wasn't forgotten. It wasn't overlooked. It was simply too sacred to record. Moses spent 40 days and 40 nights on the mountain with God. And yet, in all that time, we are only given fragments of what occurred. Commandments, instructions for the tabernacle, laws and ordinances, yes. But what about the rest? What about the silence between the words? The divine conversations that no stone tablet could hold? There were things God spoke to Moses that were never spoken aloud again. Not because they were unimportant, but because they were too intimate, too personal, too holy. Imagine it, Moses, face to the ground, the cloud thick around him, listening, not as a student taking notes, but as a friend receiving the secrets of a king. What passed between them in that sacred place may have never reached the ears of the Israelites, or even the pages of Scripture, because some truths are not meant to be shared. They're meant to be carried. The mountain was not a classroom. It was a sanctuary, and the God who created galaxies chose to draw near, not just to instruct, but to commune, to share his heart. Can you picture it? The long stretches of quiet where Moses simply sat in the presence of God, not needing to speak, not daring to move. The soft, weightless moments when the veil between time and eternity disappeared, and the two were one. Perhaps God revealed mysteries of creation, not how the stars were placed in the sky, but why. The intention behind the beauty, the love behind the order. Perhaps he spoke to Moses about the ache in his heart, the ache for a people who always wondered, always doubted, and yet were always loved. Perhaps he showed Moses a glimpse of what was to come, not in visions, but in whispers, in knowing, in presence. These were the unspoken words, words not written in ink or etched in stone, but impressed upon the soul. And they stayed with Moses long after he descended. You could see it in his face. You could feel it in his silence. He had changed, not just because he had learned something new, but because he had been with someone who changed everything. That's the thing about divine intimacy. It cannot always be explained. It leaves no evidence the way lightning does, no scar the way fire might. Instead, it leaves a glow, a stillness, a gravity in the soul that pulls you toward the eternal, even while your feet are still on the earth. When Moses came down the mountain, he didn't tell the people everything. He couldn't. Some things didn't translate. Some truths were too large for language. What God had given him wasn't just law, it was light. And light must be lived, not merely described. There's a sacred responsibility in receiving something holy. Not everything God shows you is meant for others. Some things are given for the shaping of your spirit, for the quiet work of transformation. And perhaps Moses understood that. Perhaps he knew that if he tried to explain everything he had heard, everything he had seen, it would only diminish its meaning. Because sometimes the holiest revelations are the ones that live in silence. Even today, God still speaks in this way. Not everything he shows you will be for others. Some of it will be yours alone. Words given in the night, insights whispered into your grief, visions that make no sense to anyone else, but speak directly to your bones. These are the unspoken words, the personal words, the words that don't need to be proven, only carried, lived, honored. And maybe that's why God trusted Moses with them, because he knew Moses wouldn't exploit the sacred. He wouldn't turn it into spectacle. He would guard the treasure, hide it in his heart. Let it do its quiet, eternal work. We all long to hear God speak, but are we prepared to carry what he says in silence? Are we willing to be entrusted with truths too deep for explanation? Can we accept that not every word is for the crowd, some are for the cave? God still gives unspoken words, words that shape destinies without ever being tweeted, quoted, or shared. Words that shine only in the stillness of the soul. Moses heard them. And in the end, it was not the laws he carried most heavily. It was the unseen, the unheard, the indescribable glory that had passed through him like fire through gold. And that fire never went out. Alone. It's a word we often fear, yet it has always been part of the language of the sacred. Before the people, before the commandments, before the miracles, there was Moses, alone on the mountain, high above the world, far from the noise, surrounded by cloud and silence. But this wasn't the kind of loneliness that breaks a person. This was a different kind, a holy solitude. The kind that doesn't shrink you, but reshapes you. The kind that strips away every identity, every role, every expectation, until there is nothing left but you, standing face to face with God. In that space, Moses wasn't the leader of Israel. He wasn't the man who had faced Pharaoh. He wasn't the brother of Aaron or the speaker for the people. Up there, on the mountain, he was simply a soul in the presence of the infinite. And in that space, titles meant nothing, accomplishments meant nothing. Even language began to dissolve. He wasn't there to prove anything. He was there to behold. And yet, the weight of that solitude was heavy, because even though he was with God, perhaps more deeply than anyone else in human history, he was also separated from the world, from people, from everything familiar. It's the paradox of intimacy with the divine. The closer you get to God, the further you drift from everything else, not out of pride or rejection, but because holiness exists in a space few are willing to enter. As the days passed, one after another, alone in the cloud, Moses' very body began to change. Not because of anything he did, but because of what he was near. That's the nature of divine presence. It leaves a mark. His face began to glow, not like a flickering candle or the warm hue of firelight, but with a light that came from within, a radiance that couldn't be washed off or hidden. It wasn't just light on him, it was light through him. The result of dwelling in glory for so long that it began to reflect outward like the sun breaking through stone. But that light came at a cost. When Moses finally descended the mountain, tablets in hand, heart full, face radiant, the people didn't rejoice. They didn't run to him in awe. They stepped back in fear. They couldn't handle the light. It exposed too much, revealed too much. It reminded them that something otherworldly had taken place, and that they hadn't been part of it. And so Moses veiled his face. Not because he was ashamed, not because he doubted, but because the people were not ready. The light was too much. And in a way, that veil became symbolic of a deeper truth, that those who walk closely with God often find themselves veiled from others, misunderstood, isolated, carriers of a light no one asked for. It wasn't a punishment, it was the consequence of intimacy. Moses' loneliness on the mountain didn't end when he came down. In some ways, It deepened. He had seen what they hadn't. He had heard what they never would. And once you've stood in the fire of God's presence, the ordinary world can never quite satisfy again. The food tastes the same, the days look the same, but you are not the same. And yet Moses didn't resent the people. He didn't judge them for their fear. He carried their burdens, interceded for their sins, led them through the wilderness. Because that's what true communion with God does. It doesn't make you proud, it makes you compassionate. It doesn't lift you above others, it calls you to serve them more deeply. Still, the light on his face was a constant reminder. There is a loneliness that comes with knowing God. Not the loneliness of abandonment, but of transformation. A quiet grief for the things that once filled you, but now feel empty. A longing for the presence that touched you so deeply, you now feel homesick for heaven. Moses lived the rest of his life as a man, marked by the mountain. He walked among people, but his soul remained in the cloud. He slept in tents, but his heart remembered the fire. He spoke with men, but his spirit still echoed with the silence that preceded God's voice. There was a light in him now, a lonely light, but it was holy. And in the end, perhaps that is the cost of seeing God up close. Not fame, not comfort, but a gentle isolation, a sacred set-apartness that no one can take away, and few can understand. Moses never entered the promised land, but he entered something greater. He became a friend of God, a man who didn't just carry the law, but who carried the silence, the glory, the mystery of a mountain encounter that burned so brightly. It lit his soul from the inside out. And that light never went out. Not in the wilderness, not in his leadership, not even in death. It was the light of one who had walked alone, but had never, not for 1 second, been abandoned. When Moses finally descended the mountain, the world below was not as he had left it. He had been in the cloud, immersed in presence, held in the silence and glory of God. He had been face to face with the eternal, carried by words too deep for language, changed by light that burned without flame. But now, his feet touched the dust again. The air was different, heavier, louder, thinner somehow. And the people, they were not waiting with reverence. They were not gathered in prayer or singing hymns of gratitude. They had turned away. What Moses found at the base of the mountain was not a nation prepared to meet God, but a people lost in forgetfulness, in fear, in rebellion. They had built a golden calf. In the shadow of the very mountain where God's glory rested, they had melted their jewelry and molded an idol, a statue, a thing their hands could touch, their eyes could see, something they could control. The people had grown restless while Moses was away. The silence had scared them. The waiting had become unbearable, and in their panic, they reached for something familiar. This is the tragedy of the human heart. When we cannot feel God, we often try to replace him. The golden calf wasn't just an object. It was a symptom, a sign that the people didn't want relationship. They wanted comfort, not presence, but predictability. They wanted a God who didn't ask too much, who didn't speak in thunder or vanish into smoke. They wanted something visible, tangible, tame. And Moses, fresh from the presence of the living God, saw it all. Imagine the weight of that moment, after all the fasting, the fire, the revelation, to return and find the people dancing around an idol, singing to it, offering sacrifices to it, declaring, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." It was more than betrayal. It was blindness, as if everything they had seen, plagues, parting seas, water from rock, had vanished from memory. Moses had been climbing toward the divine, but the people had been sliding back into slavery, not to Pharaoh this time, but to fear, to forgetfulness, to the familiar patterns of idolatry that Egypt had burned into their bones. And Moses, the man of silence and stillness, now roared with righteous anger. He shattered the stone tablets, the very words of God, on the ground. Not because he despised them, but because the people were not ready for them. How could he place the sacred into hands that were dancing around gold? But beneath the anger was grief. Moses had seen God. He had tasted glory. He had stood in the cleft of the rock and heard the voice of compassion. And now, that same Moses stood among people who didn't even want what he had received. He carried heaven in his heart and walked among those who still preferred the chains of the past. It is a lonely thing to descend from a mountaintop encounter into a valley of spiritual apathy. It is painful to bring light to those who have chosen shadow. And yet, Moses did not walk away. He did not climb back up the mountain to escape. He stayed, he wept, he prayed, he interceded. He became the bridge between a holy God and a broken people. And in doing so, he showed us something extraordinary, that those who have seen the highest glory are often called to walk into the darkest places, not to condemn, but to restore, not to shame, but to stand in the gap. Moses didn't use his glow to elevate himself. He used it to plead for mercy. He begged God to spare the people, to forgive them. He offered himself, "Blot me out of your book if you must, but forgive them." This is the mark of a true encounter with God. It doesn't leave you obsessed with your own experience. It drives you to love others more deeply, even when they fail, even when they don't understand, even when they wound you. Moses had seen the face of mercy, and so he became mercy. He ground the golden calf to powder, not out of vengeance, but to sever the tie between the people and their false comfort. He made them drink the dust of their idol, not as punishment, but as a lesson, that the things we worship apart from God will always turn bitter in our mouths. Still, he stayed with them. He taught, he led, he reminded, and he kept going back up the mountain, not just to meet with God, but to bring his presence back down again. Over and over, he became the go-between, the man who stood in the gap, the man who carried glory into a world that wasn't ready for it. But he never gave up on them. He saw what they could be, not just what they were. And that's because he had seen God's glory, not just as light and power, but as compassion, as long-suffering love, as grace for the stubborn-hearted. Yes, Moses descended into shadows, but he carried the light with him. And that light was never meant to stay on the mountain. It was meant to shine where it was needed most, in the valleys, in the dust, in the midst of golden idols and forgotten faith. That is the way of the prophet. That is the cost of glory. To carry the silence of heaven into the noise of earth and keep walking. Time passed, but the mountain never left him. Moses returned to the people. He gave them the laws. He established the covenant. He built the tabernacle according to the heavenly pattern he had seen. He led them through desert winds and burning sun. He dealt with complaints, rebellions, betrayals. His hair grew white, his hands grew tired, his heart was tested, broken, healed, and tested again. But through it all, something remained. What he had seen on the mountain, what he had become on the mountain, never left him. He carried it, quietly, like a flame burning behind his eyes. He didn't always speak of it. There are no long chapters explaining what he felt during those sacred 40 days and nights, but it showed in the way he moved, the way he prayed, the way he listened, the way he stood before God on behalf of people who didn't deserve it and pleaded over and over again for mercy. It showed in the way he kept going back to the tent of meeting, not out of duty, but desire. It was the closest thing to the mountain, a space where God still came down to speak with him, face to face, as one speaks to a friend. And though the cloud no longer wrapped the summit, it would descend upon the tent, and Moses would go in, not as a general with demands, but as a son returning home. He had tasted glory, and once you've tasted it, the hunger never goes away. But Moses also knew something deeper. The encounter was not just for him. The fire wasn't given to make him shine. It was given so he could light the way for others. Everything God revealed to Moses on that mountain, the commandments, yes, but also the character, the heart, the compassion, the silence, the presence. It was all meant to flow through him into a people who could barely grasp it. And that's what Moses did for the rest of his life. He became a vessel, a living memory of divine love, a man who held sacred things in fragile hands and carried them through the wilderness with trembling grace. The glow on his face may have faded with time. The people may have forgotten how much he carried, but the mountain lived on in him, not as a memory, but as a transformation. This is what we often overlook, that the greatest gift of encountering God is not just what he shows you, it's what he leaves in you. The cleft in the rock, the voice in the silence, the hand that shielded his eyes, all of it remained in Moses like a second heartbeat, a rhythm of heaven thumping quietly beneath his ribs. When the people built idols, he didn't just feel anger, he felt ache, because he had seen the real, and nothing else could compare. When they wept in fear, he wept with them, not because he feared, but because he understood what they were missing. He had seen the one who calms fear with a single, wordless glance, the one who hides in a cloud, not to avoid us, but to protect us from what we aren't ready to bear. When they refused to enter the promised land, Moses stayed. When they wanted to return to Egypt, Moses stood. He carried the weight of 1,000,000 wandering souls, and he carried the unseen glory that gave him the strength to do it. There were things he never said, things he could never explain. What it was like to feel the hand of God shield his face. What it was like to hear God proclaim his own name with such gentleness that the rocks seemed to tremble in reverence. What it was like to be so close to holiness that he forgot his own name and remembered only the echo of love that spoke the universe into being. He never wrote those parts down, not because they weren't real, but because they were too real. Some things are not meant to be described, they are meant to be lived. And when the time came, at the end of his life, Moses stood once more on a mountain. Not Sinai this time, but Nebo. He stood and looked out over the land he had led the people toward. He would not enter it. God told him so, and Moses didn't argue. He had already entered something greater. He had already touched the edge of heaven. And what remained in him was not frustration, it was peace. He had done what he was called to do. He had carried what no one else could carry. And when his spirit slipped quietly from his body, Scripture says something strange and beautiful, that God himself buried Moses. No one knows where. No one found his bones. It's as if even in death, Moses remained hidden in the cleft of the rock, cradled by the same hand that once shielded him from unbearable glory. What remained with him? Everything. The silence, the voice, the hand, the presence, the glory, the grief, the mercy, the light. He never stopped carrying it. And perhaps that is the real story, that what Moses saw on the mountain was not a moment, but a mark, not just on his skin or on his face, but deep in his soul, a mark that never faded, a flame that never died, a friendship with God that neither time nor death could erase. And that same fire waits for those willing to climb.